Have you ever woken up in the morning, rolled out of bed, and an idea strikes you and you just think, I've got to do this right now. Doesn't matter what my hair looks like. Doesn't matter that I'm wearing yesterday's shirt. Yeah, me neither. So today, I had this idea. I've been struggling with my new Sony FX6 and it matching my Sony A7S III. Now, everything that you see online is the Sony FX6 is the cinema powerhouse A7S III. And technically speaking, they have the same sensor, but they do process the image differently. And some interviews that I've done, the FX6 is the A camera, and I'm using my A7S III as the B camera. And the colors and the contrast and the sharpness and a few other things just look slightly different. I feel like I'm having a lot harder of a time matching these two cameras than I did when my A camera was the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro. I feel like I got into a really good flow of matching that Blackmagic with my Sony A7S III. So I sent out a message to a few friends seeing if anyone had a color checker, just because I want it to be a little bit more scientific. This isn't gonna be super scientific, but I wanted to see some of those color shifts, some of those contrast shifts between the two cameras. So I've got the X-Rite Color Checker Classic, and then I've also got just a basic white and 18% gray card, just a little bit larger to be able to see those and be able to check the white balance a little bit easier than just these smaller boxes here. I'm gonna take some footage with the exact same lens. So I'm using the Sony 85mm 1.8, and this is the sharpest lens that I own. The DxO mark on it, I think, is 46. So it's a really sharp, really clear, good colors, a great lens, especially for the price. It's an incredible price. And it actually gets a better DxO mark than like the Zeiss Batis 85 1.8. The 85 1.4 G Master just barely outperforms this lens, but this is, I think, less than half the price of the G Master. I've been filming with the FX6, so you can see what this image looks like. Really, all that I'm gonna be doing is doing a color space transform in DaVinci Resolve. And then I'm gonna have this exact same framing, same lens with the Sony A7S III. Okay, now I've switched over to the A7S III. So the primary differences that will have an exposure between the two cameras are twofold. Number one, the FX6 can shoot in a true shutter angle. So it was shooting in 180-degree shutter angle. But the A7S III does not have shutter angle. So we just have to use shutter speed, which they're not able to truly match up. So on the A7S III, we're filming in 24 frames per second. And so our shutter speed is 1/50th, which is the closest that we can get to a true 180-degree rule. The other aspect of it is the FX6, I'm filming in Cine EI mode. And so the base ISO for Cine EI is 800. But on the A7S III, in shooting in S-Log3, the base ISO is 640. Now to compensate that, I just brought the A7S III up to 800 to match those. All right, it's the next day. Still haven't showered, but I've got a different gray shirt on. I haven't showered because I've got a newborn and a toddler, and who has time for showers? So I'm trying to squeeze in work when I can, and work pays the bills and showering does not. So let's do this. Okay. So I've got a couple of clips of the A7S III and the FX6. You can see down here in the clip section, we're on the color page in DaVinci Resolve. A7S III is the H.264 and FX6 is the XAVC. Now it's interesting, this actually says XAVC Intra RAW. Now who knew that the FX6 could record internal RAW? Well, I don't think it really can. I'm not sure why it says that, but it is interesting that you actually do have RAW controls in the RAW section. But I think it must be some sort of bug. But all of the parameters function pretty well. So I think this is going to be a totally separate video of going in and testing out this RAW capability, which I don't think it really is. So the first thing that I did was when I imported the footage and then came over to the color tab in Resolve was normally my pipeline is doing a color space transform. So my timeline and project color space, I like to work in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And then I will view through a Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 space. So my color space transform is the exact same for the A7S3 and the FX3 because they're both shooting S-Log3 and S-Gamut3.Cine. So we have that here in the top right. You can see input color space, S-Gamut3.Cine, input gamma, S-Log3, output color space, Rec 709 and Gamma 2.4. And so that's what I want to view because that's what I will be delivering in, even though my timeline and project working space is different than that. So that was the first thing I did. So here's the FX6 with just the color space transform, and here's the A7S3 with just the color space transform. So that gets us a lot of the way there, closer to a final image. But immediately what you can see already is the color difference. So here's the A7S3 and here's the FX6. First thing that jumps out to me, here's FX6, A7S3, is the FX6, what you see right here. There's a lot more pink in my face than the A7S3. This looks a little more neutral, and we'll be able to really see that in just a second. I love to work while looking at the vector scope. And so first thing that I did was look at the vector scope, and I could see that all of these dots on the vector scope are these dots on the color checker. This is why I got it, was so that I could be a little bit more scientific. I'm not a scientist by any means, but this gives me a much more clear idea of where the colors are supposed to sit and where the colors are shifting between each of the cameras. But first thing I noticed was really the only color that is close to being properly saturated is yellow. Here, I'm going to make this a little bigger as well. All right, there we can see it bigger. All right, you can see this yellow dot is really close to the yellow box where it's supposed to live, but all of the other colors are not close in saturation. So this next node that I did was I adjusted for the saturation. In this node, I actually have white balance as well, and we'll go into that a little bit sooner. But you can see already all of the colors are much closer in where they should be sitting saturation-wise. Now, it's definitely not perfect. Cyan is shifted off where it's supposed to be. Blue is shifted off where it's supposed to be. Yellow is close. Red is close. Magenta is shifted off. And so it's not a perfect reproduction of what it should have the color sitting at, but that's okay. So I did the exact same thing on the FX6. I did the exact same amount of saturation, and then I did a white balance. And so once I did this, what I noticed in the vector scope is the difference in color separation. So I'm on the FX6 right now, and if I go back and forth between the A7S3 and the FX6, I want you to watch the green and the magenta. So here's A7S3 and FX6. A7S3, FX6. So a couple of big differences. We're looking at the FX6 right now. The color red is almost just spot on in where it should be, which is great. But we see magenta and green are actually more saturated on the FX6 than the A7S3. We can see they're spread out there and they're a little bit more compact there. So there's that is a good sign. There's more color separation that we have on the FX6 than the A7S3. I wish Sony would name their cameras a little bit easier for me to say them 100 million times. So the next thing I did was I've really started enjoying DSLR video shooters S-Log3 LUT. And the way that he describes it and the process that he went through to create the LUT, you can definitely tell that the colors are more accurate. So instead of using a color space transform that's from Resolve, I've loaded up his S-Log3 LUT. So let's look at that. I'm actually I've got this second A7S3 clip that I haven't enabled anything, but the only difference will be this is now the LUT from Caleb Pike. Instead of the color space transform, we've got the saturation and white balance that are the same as the previous clip. Now we can go back and forth between these two, and you see there is a little bit more saturation in the color space transform than Caleb Pike's LUT, but there's actually more balance between the colors because the red and yellow is not overly saturated. You can see on the color space transform, yellow is oversaturated where it should be in this box. So I decided, okay, we'll just move forward with this LUT and not use color space transform. So for the FX6, did the same thing. Not going to use the color space transform. I'm going to use the Caleb Pike LUT. So I'm going to do that on this clip as well so we can go back and forth easily. For white balance, on the same node that I was doing the saturation increase, I did white balance as well, just to be quick with it. So for white balance, what I did was I used the white balance eyedropper and came over to this large white card, clicked it, and it gave white balance. I did the exact same thing on the FX6, that same node, white balance eyedropper. There we go. So it is using Resolve's algorithms, whatever, with the eyedropper to get a proper white balance. But you can see the footage is still different. The white balance is different. It's pushing more magenta in the FX6 than it is the A7S3. So this is fixable. So I wanted to really see where the skin tones were lying, because that's the biggest difference I see is here's the FX6 with more red and more magenta in the skin tone than this, the A7S3 in the skin tone. So I wanted to see which is correct, which is lying closer to this skin tone indicator. So I did just a simple little power window, enable that, and then Shift H to only see that. So this is the A7S3. This is skin tone. Now we are just off of the skin tone indicator to the right, but and I would correct that. So I would try and shift a little bit more green, a little bit more warmth into it to get the skin tone to sit directly on that line. But let's look at the FX6. So same exact node with power window on my forehead, enable that, Shift H. And it is, you can see it extends even further over towards red. I'll go back and forth between, here's FX6 and A7S3. FX6, A7S3. They're really close, but even that small change that you see right here, the tip of this is making a visible difference to my skin tone. So let's try to fix that. So I'm going to start with the A7S3 because it's closer to the skin tone. And what I normally do is just kind of move it slightly and then go back and look at it. So I know it needs a little bit more green. I'm just going to type in 10, and it needs a little bit more warmth. I'll go 10 on this as well. All right, we'll go back here, Shift H. Okay. I think I went the wrong way. Oh, yep. I should have typed in -10 here. -10. Okay, it's closer, but we need to go even more. I'm just gonna kind of eyeball it at this point. Okay, let's see where that's sitting. Yeah, really close. Now let's look at the whole image. Yeah. It looks pretty good. I mean, you can still see some shifts in the color, but overall image, I think, looks pretty good. Now let's try and do the same for the FX6 to match that skin tone. Okay, I'm going to come here, and I know we need a lot more green, some more warmth. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that looks really good. Okay. Now let's check those against each other and see how they look. So here's the A7S3 and the FX6. Yeah. So it looks, this is the FX6. This is the A7S3. It looks like FX6 is a little too warm. So I'm going to come back, bring that down. I'm just going to type in 100. Okay. Yeah, those are skin tone wise, moving between those two. You can't get much closer than that. And I don't want to put this blob directly on the middle just because as I'm looking at the image, it's looking a little too green as if I was just coloring it by eye and not using a vector scope. And so I want to balance that. You can see our red on the color checker is smack dab red where it needs to be. It could use a little bit more saturation. But yeah, let's try that actually. Let's add just a touch more saturation to get that red right in the box. Yeah. So let's say 80. That looks good. And then I'm gonna do 80 on the A7S3 as well. But you can see even like, yeah, it's hard to, well, you can still see it. There still is a color shift. Yeah. And it's really just like the tiniest of differences in the sizes and shapes of these skin tone blobs on the vector scope. You can see this is the FX6 And there's a little bit more red that reaches over there than the A7S3. And that's the thing that's like so frustrating, is that tiny difference. You can really tell when switching between the two cameras. The A7S3 just doesn't have as much red as the FX6. It's not shifted as well. Okay, so here's something else we can try. I'm gonna add another power window and try doing a hue versus hue. So I'm going to move this up here, and we're going to try and shift that red. Yeah, okay. So we'll select red. We'll just push it. Oh, literally just that bump. Put the red dot right where it needed to be. Man, that's the tiniest of movements. That looks a lot. Let's see. Let's go back to the FX6. Yeah. That's nearly identical. Yeah. That's the hard part, is just the smallest of change to get them to match exactly. Because if you didn't have this small shift in the red hue on the A7S3, you could tell, especially with like a 2-camera setup, and like what I said I usually do of like the FX6 is the A camera and the A7S3 is the B camera. And you're switching angles and it's the same person's face on screen. You can tell that slight color shift. Just looks like something's off. It looks like it's not the same camera. Obviously it's not, but when I purchased the FX6, I purchased it to match the A7S3. And I thought it would be a lot easier than this, but it's not. The tiniest of changes make a huge impact. I'm going to close the vector scope. Another aspect that I noticed while filming was what I thought to be sharpness. I just assumed that the FX6 being a cinema camera and the A7S3 being a mirrorless body, that the A7S3 probably had some internal sharpening, because I know that it has some internal noise reduction, whereas the FX6 you can disable noise reduction, which I do, and that's a difference as well, is the noise patterns between the camera, but that's a really easy fix. But I just assumed that the FX6 was a softer image, that the A7S3 was over sharpened, and that's why you hear a lot of people talk about using diffusion filters on their cameras to get rid of that digital look. So I assumed that's what it was. So with these shots, I manually focused, and I specifically focused on this word X-Rite on the color checker to be able to tell if I could see that the FX6 was noticeably less sharp. So here's the A7S3 and here's the FX6, and I was wrong. I mean, sharpness level looks identical. If anything, there may be a little bit more detail in the FX6, and that could be just user error of not manually focusing perfectly. I could have been just a millimeter off on the A7S3, but yeah, this kind of foils that plan. Now, where I have noticed it in previous projects and previous shoots is when I'm using autofocus. And I think that could be it. This may be the next YouTube video, so don't subscribe if you want to see that. but I think it could be the autofocus on the FX6. The A7S III autofocus is insanely good. Like I'm looking at the monitor right now and it is tracking my eyes. There's a little box over this eye and it's tack sharp. The FX6, what I've noticed, it has those features. It has face tracking, it has eye tracking, but it struggles to find the eye. Usually it will only be a face, and it will lock onto an eye if it is like a face is very prominent in frame. But even then, I've noticed when it is tracking the eye, what's actually in focus is just behind. So like close to like where my hair starts or even my ear. And just that distance makes it look soft. So that's something I need to look into if there's some sort of calibration that I can do for the autofocus, or I haven't even looked to see if there's a firmware update for the FX6 that could be fixed. But I think that is probably my problem in what I've seen in my 2-camera interview setups of the A7S III looks so sharp, so good. And the FX6 has just been disappointing because I think it's just been slightly out of focus, even though it says it's in focus. So that's the next video. Like I said, don't subscribe because I have no idea what I'm doing. Peace.